The letter was stamped via mail, folded tight by regulation, and dated March 12, 1944. It should have been delivered within weeks. Instead, it surfaced years later in a quiet Army postal office in Norfolk, Virginia. Its edges worn, its paper yellowed by time. Eleanor Whitman stood alone behind the counter, sorting delayed correspondence from Europe, when the name on the envelope stopped her breath cold. Private First Class James Carter. Her fingers froze. Even after years, her body recognized that name before her mind could catch up. Eleanor had worked for the Army Postal Service since early World War II. Trusted for her precision and discretion, she had learned how fragile communication was during wartime. How letters were censored, rerouted, sometimes lost forever when bases fell or supply routes collapsed. She was trained never to read what was not addressed to her. Yet this envelope carried more than ink and paper. It carried a version of the past she had buried under routine and duty. James Carter had been a young infantryman stationed briefly in Virginia before shipping out to Europe. Their connection had been quiet, restrained, shaped by the knowledge that the war did not allow space for certainty. They shared late conversations, careful smiles, and an understanding neither dared to name. When he left, there were no promises, only a look that suggested unfinished words. Months later, a telegram arrived at Eleanor's boarding house. Killed in action. France, December 1944. The Army made it final. She remembered the day clearly. How the world seemed to narrow to a single sentence printed on official paper. Eleanor did not scream or collapse. She folded the grief inward, the way women were expected to. She kept working. She accepted Henry Walsh's gentle presence when he offered comfort without demand. Henry was safe, predictable, everything the war encouraged her to choose. Loving James became something she was not allowed to question. Now, years later, Eleanor stared at the envelope, noticing the markings of Southern Command. Rerouted, delayed by field censorship. Her pulse quickened. If this letter had been written months before James was declared dead, then it carried a voice she had never been allowed to hear. A version of him frozen in time. She hesitated, knowing that once opened, there would be no way back to ignorance. Henry appeared quietly in the doorway, his uniform pressed, his expression careful. He followed her gaze to the envelope and understood immediately. He had seen that look once before. Some letters never arrive for a reason, he said gently. His words were not a warning, but a plea. Henry had waited patiently, loving Eleanor without forcing her to choose. He represented the life that continued after loss. Eleanor looked down at the envelope one last time before breaking the seal. Inside, the letter was partially censored, whole lines blacked out. What remained was restrained, factual, and unmistakably alive. James wrote of surviving combat, of being transferred south, of hope he could not fully explain. The letter ended abruptly, without goodbye. Eleanor pressed the paper to her chest, her hands trembling. If James had lived long enough to write this, then the truth of his fate and her own might be far more complicated than the war had allowed her to believe. Eleanor did not return the letter to the sorting pile. She slipped it carefully into her satchel and walked home through streets softened by evening light, her thoughts louder than the distant hum of traffic. The war had trained her to accept uncertainty, but this was different. This was personal. James's handwriting replayed in her mind, each word restrained yet alive, contradicting the finality she had been forced to accept. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder if grief had arrived too early. That night, she reread the letter by the dim glow of a bedside lamp. The censored lines haunted her more than the words that remained. Why had James been transferred south? Why had there been no follow-up letter? She pulled open a small wooden box beneath her bed, revealing letters she had written but never sent, careful drafts filled with unsaid truths. She had stopped writing after the telegram. Reading James's words now felt like answering a call delayed by time and bureaucracy. The following morning, Eleanor requested access to archival shipping logs under the guise of routine verification. World War II had produced mountains of paperwork, and lost correspondence was not uncommon. What unsettled her were the patterns she began to notice. Entire mail batches delayed during the Italian campaign, rerouted after base evacuations, never properly reconciled. James's unit designation appeared more than once, always followed by gaps, silence recorded in ink. Henry watched her closely from across the office. He sensed the shift immediately, the way Eleanor moved, with quiet urgency, the way her eyes avoided his. During lunch, he approached her with practiced restraint. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said softly. Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm just doing my job." Henry nodded, but concern lingered. He had loved her patiently, believing time would dull the shadow of a dead man. He did not yet realize that shadow had begun to move. That evening, Eleanor visited Mrs. Carter's last known address, a modest home now occupied by strangers. The woman who answered the door remembered James vaguely, remembered the day officers had come with folded flags and solemn expressions. "They said there was no body," she recalled, "just absence." The word struck Eleanor deeply. Absence was not the same as proof. It never had been. Back home, Eleanor unfolded the letter once more, her resolve hardening. If the army had been wrong once, it could be wrong again. She knew the risks: false hope, emotional collapse, the unraveling of a future she had begun to accept. Yet the war had already taken enough from her without permission. As she placed the letter back into her satchel, a quiet decision settled in her chest. She would find out what happened to James Carter. And whatever the truth was, it would no longer remain buried in silence. Eleanor's search became a careful ritual, performed in the quiet margins of her workdays. She learned which filing cabinets were rarely checked, which shipment logs were considered closed history. World War II had ended, but its paperwork lived on in Shadow's misfiled reports. Partial manifests, casualty lists amended too late to matter. Each document she touched felt like trespassing into a life she was not supposed to reopen. Yet every time she hesitated, James's restrained handwriting returned to her mind, steady and unmistakably alive. Henry noticed her agitation that evening when she missed a routine verification meeting. He found her in the records room, surrounded by files, her composure slipping. "Eleanor," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "This isn't just curiosity anymore." His voice held no accusation, only worry. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw how deeply he had anchored himself to her life. "If you thought someone you loved might not be dead," she asked softly, "would you stop looking?" Henry had no answer. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sometimes the truth hurts more than uncertainty." Eleanor swallowed. She had lived inside uncertainty for years. It had shaped her decisions, her silences, her acceptance of a life that never fully fit. "I can't unknow this," she said, "and I can't pretend the war didn't take more than it admitted." That night, Eleanor dreamed of rain-soaked cobblestones and distant artillery, of James turning to speak only for his voice to vanish under thunder. She woke before dawn with a sharp certainty. The casualty report that declared James dead had been filed during a chaotic withdrawal period in late 1944. Entire units had been misreported during that winter. Survivors reassigned, prisoners unaccounted for. The army had corrected some errors, but not all. She dressed quickly, driven by a resolve she no longer questioned. Her next lead came unexpectedly from a retired clerk who recognized James's name when Eleanor asked about Italian POW transport logs. "There were men we never confirmed," he said carefully. "Transferred, captured. Some released years later. Not everyone came home the way they left." The word struck Eleanor like a quiet explosion. Years later, she thanked him, her hands trembling, and stepped outside into the cold air. As she stood on the sidewalk, the weight of what she was doing finally settled in. If James had survived, then everything she believed about her past and the future she was building was at risk. If he had not, then she was reopening a wound that had barely healed. Eleanor pressed the letter against her coat, steadying herself. Somewhere between loss and hope, she felt the war reach forward again, demanding an answer it had delayed for far too long. Eleanor waited until the office emptied before pulling the Italian POW transport ledger from the bottom drawer. The paper smelled faintly of dust and oil, the ink pressed thin by time. Names marched down the page in careful columns, interrupted by handwritten notes that suggested urgency rather than certainty. She traced the dates with her finger, aligning them with James's transfer record: April, May, June of 1944. The months overlapped in a way that tightened her chest. This was not proof, but it was possibility. She copied what she could onto a slip of paper. Her handwriting, small and controlled. A convoy routed south after Anzio, a temporary detention site near Bari. A release notation with no follow-up. Eleanor's breath slowed as she read. Prisoners moved fast, records slower. She knew this from her work. Letters went missing. Men went missing. And sometimes the two disappeared together. The war did not always bother to correct itself. Henry found her just as she closed the ledger. He did not speak at first, only leaned against the doorframe, studying her with a familiarity earned over years of quiet devotion. You're chasing something that may not want to be found, he said gently. Eleanor met his gaze, feeling the unspoken plea in his words. Henry had offered her a future without ghosts. He had waited. He had protected her from questions she never asked aloud. And now she was choosing to reopen everything. I need to know, she said simply. Henry stepped closer, lowering his voice. And if knowing costs you the life you're building? The question landed hard. Eleanor looked away, fingers tightening around her notes. Then it was never really mine, she replied. The truth hurt them both. Henry nodded once, absorbing the loss he had felt coming for weeks. He would not stop her, but he would not follow her into the past either. That night, rain fell steadily as Eleanor walked the long way home. Her coat pulled tight, she imagined James somewhere far from Virginia, alive in a way the army never recorded. The thought felt dangerous, intoxicating. At her boarding house, she found a letter slipped under her door, Henry's handwriting. He wrote of respect, of restraint, of loving her enough not to compete with a man the war had unfinished. Eleanor pressed the letter to her lips, grief and gratitude tangling in her chest. Sleep brought memories she did not invite. A flashback of Union Station, James's hand brushing hers as the train hissed behind him. A moment where he almost spoke, almost promised. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a certainty that frightened her. If James had lived beyond April 1944, then the casualty report that ended her waiting had been built on absence, not truth. And absence, she now understood, was not an ending. The next morning, a reply awaited her inquiry to a Red Cross tracing request she had quietly submitted weeks earlier. The envelope was thin, official. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single line that stole her breath. Record inconclusive. Further verification pending. Eleanor closed her eyes, heart racing. Inconclusive meant the story was still open, and somewhere beyond the reach of her certainty, the war was preparing to answer one way or another. The Red Cross response stayed folded in Eleanor's coat pocket for days, its single sentence heavier than any official declaration she had ever received. Record inconclusive. Those words followed her through her routines, through the postal office, through quiet meals eaten alone. In World War II, inconclusive meant survival was possible. That possibility rewrote everything. Eleanor had lived years believing James Carter's story was finished. Now she was standing at the edge of a chapter the war had never closed. Her next step took her beyond paperwork and into memory. Eleanor traveled to a small veterans assistance office outside Richmond, where former servicemen gathered to request benefits or corrections to long-buried records. The building smelled of old paper and stale coffee. She sat quietly, listening to fragments of stories men misreported. Units dissolved, names lost during transfers. When she finally spoke James's name, an older clerk paused, his brow furrowing. Carter, Italy, he murmured. There were delays there, a lot of them. The clerk explained that several American soldiers captured during the Italian campaign had been transferred between camps before records stabilized. Some were released late, some repatriated quietly, others reassigned under administrative confusion. Families weren't always notified, he said. Sometimes the war moved on faster than the truth. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. The idea that James might have survived, only to be lost in procedure rather than combat, felt both hopeful and unbearable. Henry sensed the shift immediately when Eleanor returned home later than usual. He stood by the window of the boarding house parlor, his expression controlled but strained. You're already gone, he said softly. Eleanor turned to him, heart heavy. I don't know how to stay, she replied. Henry nodded. accepting what he could not change. He loved her enough to step aside, but the cost showed in his eyes. This was the quiet sacrifice the war never recorded. That night, Eleanor opened James's letter again, studying the censored lines with new urgency. She noticed something she had missed before: a reference to a chaplain, a partial location code, a date that matched the clerk's mention of camp transfers. The letter was not just a message. It was a map, incomplete but deliberate. James had written carefully, aware his words might be read, hoping she would understand what could not be said. As Eleanor placed the letter back into its envelope, resolve settled into her chest. She would follow the path the war had obscured, even if it led her far from the life she had begun to accept. Outside, a train passed through the night, its low whistle echoing through the dark. Eleanor watched the shadows move across the wall and understood something with sudden clarity. This search was no longer about the past alone. It was about choosing whether love lost to war deserved to be found again, no matter the cost. Eleanor's search crossed an invisible line when she requested access to declassified correspondence summaries tied to the Italian campaign. The clerk who processed the request did not ask questions, but his raised eyebrow told her enough. These were not records meant to reopen old stories. As she reviewed the summaries, patterns emerged: soldiers listed as missing, later marked presumed killed, then quietly referenced again in transfer notes months later. The war had moved bodies faster than truth, and Eleanor felt herself stepping into that forgotten gap. One entry stopped her cold. A partial name, a service number missing its final digit, a note referencing a temporary medical station near Bari in late summer of 1944. Eleanor's heart raced. James had written of an injury dismissed in a single censored line. The dates aligned too closely to ignore it. She copied the reference, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. This was no longer hope built on absence. This was structure, evidence, possibility shaped by fact. Henry noticed her distance grow into something final. One evening, he found her packing documents into a small case, her movements deliberate. "You're leaving," he said quietly. Eleanor did not deny it. "I need to follow this," she replied, "not because I expect a miracle, but because I can't live knowing I turned away." Henry exhaled slowly, pain and admiration colliding. "If you find him," he asked, "will there be space for anything else?" Eleanor met his eyes. "I don't know," she said honestly. That answer cost them both. The journey to New York was long and reflective, the train's rhythm pulling Eleanor into memories she had kept sealed. She remembered James's restraint, the way he never promised what the war might steal. She remembered choosing safety when the telegram arrived, choosing a life that did not require waiting. Now she was waiting again, only this time by choice. When the train slowed into the station, Eleanor felt the weight of that decision settle fully onto her shoulders. At the International Red Cross office, the air was heavy with quiet resolve. Files were reviewed, names cross-checked. Eleanor presented her findings carefully, respectfully. The official assisting her paused when James's name surfaced alongside the Italian medical reference. There were men who survived captivity and were repatriated under restricted status, he explained. Some were reassigned. Some never reconnected with their former lives. Eleanor's breath caught. Survived captivity. The words echoed louder than hope. When Eleanor stepped back onto the street, the city moved around her, unaware that her world had shifted. She folded the new confirmation slip into her coat, hands trembling. There was still no certainty, no address, no promise. But there was proof that James Carter had lived beyond the moment she was told he died. And standing there, surrounded by strangers, Eleanor understood the truth. She could no longer escape. Whatever waited at the end of this search would change her forever. And the war, silent for years, was about to speak again. The confirmation slip burned against Eleanor's chest as she returned to Virginia, its thin paper heavier than any suitcase she carried. James Carter had survived past the date of his reported death. That fact alone had fractured the life she had built around certainty. Yet survival did not mean reunion. The Red Cross official had been careful, almost apologetic. Records after repatriation were inconsistent. Some men vanished into reassignment. Others chose not to return to the lives they had lost. Eleanor understood that survival could be its own kind of exile. Back at the postal office, Eleanor moved through her duties with practiced calm, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Every letter she handled felt charged with possibility and failure. She began discreetly contacting veteran associations, chaplain archives, and hospital registries tied to post-war transfers. Each inquiry returned fragments mentions of men recovering under assumed privacy, of soldiers instructed not to contact previous correspondents due to classified service. The war had not ended cleanly for everyone. For some, it simply changed shape. Henry approached her one final time, standing beside her desk with quiet resolve. "I've been offered a transfer," he said. "Chicago." Eleanor looked up, startled. He gave a small, sad smile. "I thought it would be easier for both of us." The truth settled between them. Henry had loved her without condition, but he could not remain in the shadow of a man who might still be alive. Eleanor reached for his hand, squeezing it once. Gratitude, regret, and farewell folded into that single gesture. That night, Eleanor found herself returning to the beginning Union Station, in memory, where James had once stood under rising steam. She remembered the way he had looked at her, as if trying to memorize her face. Back then, she had believed restraint was strength. Now she wondered how much silence had cost them both. The war had taken his voice. She had allowed it to take hers as well. Days later, a reply arrived from a veterans hospital registry in Pennsylvania. The letter was cautious, impersonal. A patient matching James Esservy's number partial match only had been treated there in late 1946, following overseas reassignment, discharged under restricted classification. No forwarding address. Eleanor sat with the letter, trembling in her hands. 1946. 2 years after she had buried him, 2 years after she had stopped waiting. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her resolve sharpening into something unshakable. If James had returned to American soil, then he had breathed the same air, walked the same streets, unknowingly close. That knowledge was unbearable and undeniable. As she placed the letter beside the others, Eleanor understood that she was no longer searching for closure. She was searching for a living man shaped by silence, just as she had been. And somewhere ahead, beyond records and restraint, the war's final truth was preparing to surface. Eleanor followed the trail west, guided by fragments of records and instincts sharpened by years of waiting. Pennsylvania led to Ohio, to a decommissioned rehabilitation center outside St. Louis that no longer appeared on most maps. World War II had ended, but its aftermath lingered in places like this half-forgotten facilities, where men were stitched back together and quietly released into lives that no longer recognized them. As Eleanor stepped off the bus, the air felt heavy, as if the past were holding its breath. Inside the county archives, an elderly clerk listened patiently as Eleanor explained her search. When she mentioned restricted discharges, the man nodded slowly. "Some soldiers were advised to start over," he said. "No contact, no explanations. It was easier that way. Easier for the system," Eleanor thought, "not for the people left behind." He slid a thin folder across the desk. Inside was a work placement record tied to a temporary name. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the service number fragment matched. Eleanor's heart pounded. The placement led to a steel plant on the outskirts of town, long since closed. Eleanor stood across the street, staring at the rusted gates, imagining James walking through them years earlier, alive but unreachable. The idea hurt in a way she had not anticipated. Survival had not brought him back to her. It had merely relocated his silence. For the first time, Eleanor wondered if finding him would reopen wounds that time had barely sealed. That evening, she sat alone in a modest boarding room, rereading James's letter. The censored lines no longer felt like obstacles, but boundaries he had been forced to obey. She noticed a phrase she had overlooked before. I'm not allowed to choose where I go next. At the time, she had assumed it was fear speaking. Now she understood it was instruction. James had been moved, managed, reshaped by forces neither of them could resist. The next morning, Eleanor received an unexpected visit. A middle-aged woman introduced herself as Margaret Lawson, a local librarian. "You're asking about a man who worked here years ago," she said cautiously. Eleanor's breath caught. Margaret explained that she had catalogued employment records during the plant's closure. "There was a James," she said. quiet. Kept to himself, left town suddenly. Eleanor's hands trembled. "Do you know where he went?" she asked. Margaret hesitated. "I know who he left with." They walked together to a small cemetery at the edge of town. Wind bending the tall grass low, Margaret stopped before a modest headstone bearing a different surname. "He visited every week," she said softly. Never spoke much, but he stood like a man carrying something unfinished. Eleanor stared at the stone, fear tightening her chest. If this was where James had anchored his life after the war, then the truth she was chasing might not be the reunion she imagined but a reckoning with. Everything silence had stolen from them both. Eleanor stood before the headstone longer than she meant to. The unfamiliar surname etched into stone, refusing to explain itself. The dates told a partial story. Born in the same year as James, died far too young for a man who had already survived a war. Margaret Lawson waited a respectful distance away, understanding that some truths needed silence before words. Eleanor's thoughts raced. If James had tethered himself to this grave, then whoever lay beneath it had shaped the life he lived after disappearing from hers. Margaret finally spoke, her voice careful. "He never said much about the war," she explained. "But he talked about duty, about owing someone a life he was never allowed to live." Eleanor felt the meaning settle painfully into place. This was not a rival or a replacement. This was responsibility. Protection. A promise forged under circumstances Eleanor could barely imagine. The war had not simply separated them, it had redirected James's capacity for love into survival. For someone else. At the library, Margaret retrieved a slim folder from a locked cabinet. Inside were community records, employment notes, hospital visits, a single emergency contact listed under a restricted alias. The contact was a woman named Anna, widowed in 1945. Eleanor's breath caught. A widow, a child, perhaps, a life James had stepped into not by desire, but by necessity. Margaret closed the folder gently. "He left town when she passed," she said. "Said it was time to finish something he never could." That night, Eleanor barely slept. She imagined James caring for another family, carrying his silence like a shield, believing she had moved on just as he had been forced to. The letter he wrote in 1944 returned to her mind, its restraint, its careful omissions. He had been alive, but not free. And neither had she. As dawn broke, Eleanor understood that the reunion she sought would not be simple joy. It would be an accounting. The address came from the folder's final page, nearly illegible but precise enough. A coastal town in Maine. Eleanor boarded the early train, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She rehearsed nothing. There were no words for 50 years of absence shaped by war and bureaucracy. She watched the coastline emerge through the window, waves breaking against rock, relentless and honest. If James was there, she would see the man the war had left behind. By late afternoon, Eleanor stood across the street from a modest gray house facing the sea. A man was visible through the window, shoulders bowed, hands steady as he repaired a fishing net. The posture was unmistakable. Eleanor's chest tightened as the door opened briefly, letting in light and wind. She crossed the street on instinct, not courage. Andros hesitated inches from the door. Inside, a life shaped by silence waited, and for the first time since 1944, Eleanor was close enough to hear what the war had never finished saying. Eleanor stood on the porch for several seconds before knocking, the sound of the ocean filling the space where words had failed her for decades. When the door finally opened, James Carter looked older than the man she had loved and younger than the ghost she had mourned. His hair was gray, his face marked by time and restraint, but his eyes, those eyes stilled her completely. Recognition passed through him like a wave. He did not speak at first. Neither did she. 50 years collapsed into silence. "Eleanor," he finally said, voice rough, as if unused to saying her name aloud. Hearing it from him again hurt more than the telegram ever had. She nodded, afraid that if she spoke too quickly, she would lose her footing. James stepped aside, allowing her in. The house was modest, orderly, filled with the quiet routines of a man who had learned to live without asking for more. On a small shelf rested a folded American flag, another promise kept in silence. They sat across from each other, the space between them heavy but honest. James spoke first, explaining what the records never had: capture, injury, reassignment under conditions that forbade contact. He had been told Eleanor would be informed if he survived. She never was. When he returned to the United States, he believed she had moved on, married, lived a full life without him. "I didn't want to reopen a wound," he said quietly. Eleanor felt tears spill freely now. "I was never given the choice to heal," she replied. James told her about Anna, about the child he had helped raise, about the promise he made to a dying friend who asked him to protect what the war had broken. It had never been romance, it had been duty. Eleanor listened, understanding at last the shape his life had taken. Survival had demanded sacrifice from them both. When James finished, his shoulders sagged, as if releasing a burden carried too long. "I loved you," he said simply. "I never stopped." Eleanor crossed the room and took his hands, the touch grounding and real. There was no anger left in her, only grief for time stolen and gratitude for truth finally spoken. "We were both loyal," she said softly. "Just two different silences." James nodded, tears tracking down his face without shame. For a moment, they allowed themselves to mourn not just what they lost, but what had never been permitted to begin. As evening settled, they walked along the shoreline together, the wind carrying salt and memory. There was no promise of reclaiming youth, no fantasy of undoing the past. But there was peace. Eleanor realized love did not require ownership or repair, it required recognition. James had survived the war. She had survived the waiting, and in finding each other at last, they had given meaning to the letter that was never delivered. When Eleanor boarded the train the next morning, she carried no regret. The war had shaped their fate, but it had not erased their truth. Some love stories were not meant to be lived forward only, understood fully at the end. And as the coastline faded from view, Eleanor knew that at last, the silence between them had finally said everything it needed to say.